If isolation has ever scared you more than violence, subscribe now, because this story isn't about escape from Alcatraz, but about what stays with you long after you leave. And I learned that on my first day on the island, when I realized the silence there isn't empty, but contained, held in place the way pressure is held underwater. And as a restoration researcher assigned to document structural decay, I expected crumbling concrete and rusted bars, not the sensation that every step I took was being quietly matched by something behind me. Not footsteps exactly, but a subtle correction in the air, as if the space itself adjusted to my presence. And Alcatraz, during off hours, feels nothing like a museum, because once the last ferry leaves the island, does not relax. It tightens, the wind sharpening, the fog settling lower, and the cell house stands not abandoned, but patient, waiting in a way buildings shouldn't. And as I began my initial walkthrough, I noticed something that didn't appear in any official report, which was that certain cells produced the same physiological response no matter who entered them. A sudden heaviness in the chest, a narrowing of attention, a strange urge to stand still and face the wall. And at first, I dismissed this as suggestion, the power of reputation influencing perception, until I mapped the reactions and found the overlap too precise to ignore. Always the same few cells, always the same duration before the sensation peaked, and never any visible environmental explanation. And when I stepped into one of them myself, a narrow concrete box with flaking paint and a small barred window angled toward nothing useful, I felt time thicken. Not slow dramatically, but lose its edges. Seconds blending together until I could no longer tell how long I had been standing there. And the unsettling part was not fear, but comfort. A quiet relief in knowing exactly where I was and how much space I occupied. Because the cell defined that for me with ruthless clarity. And when I stepped back into the corridor, the openness felt wrong, exaggerated, almost hostile, as if the world had suddenly grown careless with its dimensions. And that night, in my temporary quarters on the island, I reviewed inmate records, focusing not on escape attempts or violence, but on behavioral notes written long after sentences ended. Post-release evaluations that were never meant for public access. And a pattern emerged that no historian had highlighted. Former inmates describing identical habits decades apart. Sleeping facing walls. Measuring rooms obsessively. Experiencing panic in wide open spaces. And most disturbingly, reporting that moments of extreme stress brought a vivid sense of being back in their cells. Not as memory, but as location. As if part of them had never fully left. And I began to understand that Alcatraz's reputation for breaking men was imprecise. Because breaking implies damage, whereas what this place did was far more exact. It reshaped how the mind located itself in space, training consciousness to anchor in confinement until that confinement felt safer than freedom. And walking the tiers late at night, I noticed how the cells were designed not just to isolate bodies, but to standardize experience. Identical dimensions, identical sightlines, identical limits. And the more I observed, the more it became clear that isolation here was not a punishment, but a method. One refined over years to produce a specific internal state. And standing alone in the D-block corridor, surrounded by doors that once closed on men for days and weeks at a time, I felt the first true warning, not as fear, but as recognition. A subtle sense that this place did not care whether anyone remembered it as cruel or historic, because its real legacy was quieter and far more durable. And as the lights dimmed automatically for the night, and the island settled into its offshore stillness, I realized, with growing unease, that Alcatraz did not end sentences when prisoners left. It simply taught them a version of solitude so complete that it followed them forever. And I had only just begun to feel what that lesson was like. The second day on the island began with a strange contradiction, because nothing had changed physically, yet everything felt more narrowly defined, as if my range of motion had been subtly reduced without walls moving an inch. And I noticed it first in small behaviors, pausing longer before stepping through doorways, choosing the same paths through the cell house, even when alternatives were available, my body favoring predictability over efficiency. And as I continued my documentation work, I focused on D Block, the isolation wing whose reputation had eclipsed even the rest of Alcatraz. And what struck me immediately was that the cells there were not merely darker or more restrictive, but acoustically precise. Sounds did not echo naturally, but returned altered, flattened, as if the space absorbed individuality and returned only a simplified version. And when I closed one of the cell doors to test its mechanics, the final metallic click produced a sudden wave of relief so strong it startled me. A sensation I could not justify, yet felt undeniably real. And reviewing further records that afternoon, I uncovered a secondary classification used internally during certain years, a designation applied to inmates who responded correctly to isolation. Men who did not hallucinate or lash out, but instead grew calmer, quieter, more contained. And rather than being transferred or released early, they were often kept in solitary longer than necessary, as if their response was being studied, refined. And when I cross-referenced these names with post-release histories, the pattern deepened, because many of them struggled to reintegrate not due to trauma, but due to preference, expressing discomfort with unpredictability, crowds, open environments, and even choice itself. And later that evening, while alone in one of the standard cells, I tested something that had been bothering me since my arrival, which was the sense that the cells did not just limit space, but taught a specific posture of attention. So I stood exactly as inmates were instructed to, facing the wall, hands behind my back, eyes fixed on a point that offered no stimulation. And within moments, my thoughts narrowed, external noise receding, internal dialogue quieting, replaced by a focused stillness that felt disturbingly efficient. And when I stepped back into the corridor, that efficiency did not leave. It lingered, making the outside world feel wasteful, overly complex. And as the sun set beyond the barred windows and the bay faded into shadow, I realized that Alcatraz's most effective restraint was not the bars or the water, but the way it conditioned the mind to associate confinement with clarity. And as I prepared to leave the cell house for the night, a thought settled with quiet certainty that unsettled me deeply, which was that if a place could teach the brain to feel safer in a cage than in freedom, then the cage never really needed to be locked at all. By the third day, the island began to feel less like a location and more like a posture, a way of holding myself that followed me from the cell house to the dock and back again. And I noticed that when I stood in open areas, my shoulders tightened instinctively, my attention scattering until I subconsciously sought boundaries, walls, railings, anything that defined an edge. And this was when I realized that Alcatraz did not merely imprint memories, but trained spatial dependence, teaching the mind to function optimally only within limits. And as I continued my research, I shifted focus from individual cells to the routines that govern them. Because isolation here was never absolute. It was precisely timed, measured, and interrupted just enough to prevent complete detachment, creating a loop of deprivation and minimal stimulus that locked attention inward. And this loop revealed itself in inmate journals, where men described losing interest in external events while developing an intense awareness of their own internal rhythms, counting breaths, footsteps, heartbeats, until the self became the only environment left. And what unsettled me most was discovering that many of these men described this transition not as suffering, but as adaptation, even improvement, using language that echoed my own recent notes about clarity and efficiency. And as the similarity grew harder to ignore, I attempted to ground myself by taking the ferry to the mainland for supplies, expecting relief. Yet the moment I stepped onto the open deck, the space felt overwhelmingly exposed, the horizon too wide, the absence of walls creating a low-grade panic I could not fully suppress. And I found myself standing near the rail, body angled inward, replicating the posture I had practiced in the cell. And when we reached shore, the city felt chaotic, inefficient, its openness suddenly oppressive. And I returned to the island sooner than planned, unsettled by how quickly my relief had turned into discomfort. And that night, alone in the cell house, I realized something critical while reviewing my notes, which was that I had begun framing my experiences not as warning signs, but as adjustments, using the same neutral language found in the old records. And the implications of that hit hard, because it meant the process did not require incarceration or coercion, only repeated exposure and subtle reinforcement. And standing between rows of empty cells, I felt a strange solidarity with the men who had once occupied them. Not empathy, but alignment. A recognition that they too had likely reached a point where resistance felt unnecessary. And as the lights dimmed and the island settled into its offshore stillness, I understood that Alcatraz's true experiment had never ended with the prison's closure. It had simply lost its subjects, waiting quietly for anyone willing to stay long enough to learn the lesson it still knew how to teach. By the fourth day, I stopped thinking of the cells as empty. Not because I sensed presences or imagined figures, but because the absence itself had weight, a structured vacancy that felt deliberately maintained. And I began to understand that Alcatraz was not haunted by people, but by states of mind that had been shaped here and left behind, lingering like impressions pressed too deeply into concrete to ever fully fade. And this realization sharpened when I noticed that my work patterns had changed without conscious decision. My breaks shorter, my movements more economical, my notes increasingly concise, stripped of qualifiers and emotional language, as if I were optimizing myself to match the environment rather than studying it. And I tested this awareness by deliberately behaving inefficiently, lingering in wide corridors, pacing irregularly, standing in open spaces longer than necessary. And each time, a subtle discomfort surfaced. Not pain, but a pressure to correct myself, to return to edges, to align with walls, to reduce unnecessary movement. And this internal correction felt disturbingly similar to relief. And that was when I accepted that the conditioning did not require confinement. It only required enough time for the mind to learn which states were rewarded with calm. And digging deeper into declassified reports that afternoon, I discovered a set of internal assessments conducted not on prisoners, but on staff, wardens, guards, and administrators, evaluating their tolerance for prolonged exposure to isolation zones, noting how long they could remain in the cell house without exhibiting symptoms of spatial withdrawal. And those who scored highest were not promoted out, but kept on site longer, rotated through isolation wings, their notes praised for objectivity and emotional restraint. And I realized that Alcatraz had never been interested solely in inmates. It studied anyone who remained, refining its understanding of how long-term exposure reshaped perception, regardless of role. And as evening approached, I experienced the first moment that truly frightened me. Not because something unusual happened, but because nothing did. As I stood alone in a cell with the door open and felt no urge to leave, the open corridor behind me registering as excess rather than opportunity. And in that moment, it became clear that the final stage of Alcatraz's influence was not confinement, but internalization. When the boundaries became unnecessary because they had already been installed within the mind. And as the fog rolled in from the bay, swallowing the island in familiar obscurity, I understood that whatever lesson this place taught, it did so patiently, without force, waiting only for the observer to realize that solitude, once perfected, no longer requires walls to sustain itself. The final realization did not arrive suddenly, but settled in gradually, like the tide pulling back from the shore until the shape of the seabed becomes unmistakable. And I understood that my mistake had been believing the island was influencing me, when in truth, it had merely revealed something that could be learned anywhere, given the right conditions. Because Alcatraz was not unique in its cruelty, but in its precision. A place where isolation had been refined into a language the mind could understand fluently. And on my last day, I walked the cell house not as a researcher, but as a participant, completing an experiment I had not consented to, yet could no longer deny. Moving efficiently, purposefully, instinctively avoiding open spaces, my body selecting walls and corners without instruction. And when I stood inside one of the D-block cells for the final time, I did not test its effect or measure my response. I simply occupied it. And the calm that followed was immediate and total. A clarity so clean it bordered on relief. Because inside that narrow concrete frame, the world made sense again. Reduced to scale, stripped of excess. And when I stepped back out, the corridor felt exaggerated, wasteful, asking too much of my attention. And that was when the full weight of Alcatraz's legacy became clear. Because the prison did not need to hold anyone anymore. It had already succeeded in teaching generations of minds how to build their own cells, portable and permanent. And as I boarded the ferry for the last time, I did not feel triumph or escape, only a subtle discomfort as the distance between walls increased with every passing meter, the horizon expanding into something I was no longer equipped to process without strain. And the city ahead appeared not welcoming, but overwhelming. A sprawl of unnecessary choices and undefined spaces. And I realized that freedom, once unbounded, is not automatically liberating. It is only tolerable if the mind has not been trained to fear its size. And as the island receded into fog behind me, I felt no sense of leaving it behind, because the lesson had already transferred, the posture already set, the internal dimensions already fixed. And later, in a small apartment on the mainland, I caught myself sleeping facing the wall, arranging furniture to reduce open space, choosing narrow hallways over wide rooms, not out of fear, but preference. And that preference was the true endpoint of the experiment, because nothing was forcing me, nothing was watching, nothing was correcting me anymore. And yet the cell remained, perfectly intact, quietly functional. And in that understanding lay the final horror of Alcatraz, that it no longer needs walls, guards, or prisoners, only time and exposure. Because once solitude is learned deeply enough, the door never has to be closed again. I arrived at Alcatraz with the expectation that archives would be the least emotional part of the island. Concrete can intimidate, cells can unsettle, but paperwork is supposed to be inert. Dates do not scream, numbers do not lie. That assumption did not survive my first full day inside the records room. My assignment was simple. I was contracted to digitize administrative documents that had never been fully cataloged. Intake forms, transfer logs, sentencing summaries. Most of them had already been reviewed by historians, but only selectively. The focus had always been on famous inmates, escape attempts, violence. My task was to process everything else, the boring material, the margins. The records room was colder than the rest of the building. Not dramatically so, but consistently. The temperature never adjusted correctly, no matter how the system was set. I noticed that the longer I stayed, the less I was aware of the cold, as if my body adapted faster than it should have. The first inconsistency appeared in a transfer log from 1937. A prisoner listed as arriving at Alcatraz on June 14th was also recorded as being transferred out on June 11th. At first, I assumed a clerical error, a miswritten date. That kind of mistake is common in handwritten records. I marked it for review and continued working. An hour later, I found the same name again, this time in an intake ledger dated 2 years earlier. The handwriting matched, the inmate number matched, the sentence length matched. The arrival date did not. According to this document, the man had not yet been convicted at the time he was supposedly already incarcerated. That was when I stopped assuming coincidence. I pulled every file associated with that inmate and laid them out in chronological order. They refused to align. Each document made sense on its own. Together, they described mutually exclusive timelines. In one version, the man served his sentence and was released. In another, he remained incarcerated indefinitely. In a third, he was transferred before he ever arrived. There were no notes explaining the discrepancy, no corrections, no annotations in the margins. The system treated each version as valid. By late afternoon, I had identified 5 more inmates with similar issues, all male, all long-term prisoners, all with sentences involving repeated reviews, life with possibility of parole, indeterminate sentencing, administrative flexibility. The common factor was not who they were. It was how often their time had been recalculated. I requested access to audit records. These were internal documents used during inspections and federal reviews. They were never meant to be read consecutively, only sampled. When I read them in sequence, a pattern emerged that made me uncomfortable. Each time a sentence was reviewed, the records became less stable. Dates drifted, durations blurred, transfers duplicated. The system did not correct itself. It compounded. I began to wonder whether this was simply the result of poor record-keeping layered over decades. That explanation held until I found a memo from a warden's office noting concern about temporal inconsistency during administrative reconciliation. The phrase was never explained. No follow-up existed. That night, I walked the cell house after hours. Not for research, for context. I wanted to stand in the space where these inconsistencies had originated. The cells were quiet, not ominous, just still. I tried to imagine how time would feel when every day was identical, and every review promised resolution that never quite arrived. Standing there, it occurred to me that a sentence is not just a duration. It is an agreement between an institution and a person about when something ends. What happens if the institution loses the ability to define that ending? The next morning, I returned to the archives with a sense of restraint I could not explain. I worked more carefully, more slowly. I double-checked every entry. That was when I noticed something subtle but disturbing. Some of the documents were newer than they should have been. Ink that had not fully faded. Paper that had aged less than surrounding files. Updated formatting that did not match the period. These documents did not announce themselves as revisions. They simply existed, inserted quietly into the timeline. The system was not preserving history. It was maintaining it. And as I logged the final entry of the day, I noticed that the database required me to assign a status to each record. Closed, transferred, completed, or ongoing. For several inmates, none of those options were accurate. I selected ongoing and saved the file. The system accepted it without comment. That was the moment I realized I was not documenting a past failure. I was interacting with something that had never finished. By the third day, I stopped referring to the inconsistencies as errors. Errors imply deviation from a stable system. What I was observing felt more like the system behaving exactly as it was designed, just not in a way that was ever meant to be noticed all at once. I expanded my search. Instead of following individual inmates, I followed the process itself. Intake, review, reclassification, transfer consideration, release eligibility. Each step was documented separately, often by different offices, sometimes years apart. When read in isolation, each document was reasonable. When assembled into a continuous sequence, they formed something unstable. Time in these records did not progress. It oscillated. One inmate's sentence was recalculated 9 times over 15 years. Each recalculation was framed as a correction. Each correction altered the starting point. One review adjusted the length. Another adjusted the interpretation. None of them acknowledged the previous adjustment. The sentence did not shorten or lengthen. It lost definition. I found notes from administrative staff expressing confusion that felt eerily restrained. Phrases like status unclear and pending clarification repeated across decades. No one ever wrote unsolvable. The system did not allow that conclusion. What unsettled me was how the paperwork treated uncertainty as temporary, even when it persisted for years. There was an assumption embedded in the process that the sentence would eventually resolve itself if reviewed often enough. I began noticing a linguistic shift in later documents. Early records spoke in absolutes: sentenced, transferred, released. Later ones used softer terms: considered, reviewed, adjusted, maintained. The language avoided finality. I requested personnel logs. I wanted to see who had handled these files. There was significant overlap. Certain clerks and administrators appeared repeatedly across decades, often remaining in positions longer than average. They were described as reliable, detail-oriented, resistant to error. Several of them never transferred to other facilities. One file included a personal note written by a mid-level administrator in the late 1950s. It was not meant for circulation. It had been folded into a folder and forgotten. The handwriting was tight and controlled. It read, "Some men here are never late. They are never early. They simply remain scheduled." I did not know what that meant. I was not sure the writer did either. That evening, I reviewed post-release data. A small number of the affected inmates had been discharged. On paper, they completed their sentences. In practice, their records continued to update. Addresses changed, status fields refreshed, notes added. The institution kept accounting for them long after it no longer had authority to do so. I wondered if this was a bureaucratic habit, a failure to close files. But the updates were too specific, too consistent. It was as if the system required these individuals to remain administratively present. The next day, I noticed a new field in the digitization interface. It had not been there before. Or perhaps I had simply not reached the records that required it. The field was labeled Sentence Continuity. There were only two selectable values: stable, unstable. No explanation accompanied it. I selected unstable for one inmate. The system paused for several seconds before accepting the entry. A small warning appeared: review pending. I did not submit the review. Later that night, while rereading older ledgers, I realized something I had previously overlooked. Several of the affected inmates had no recorded emotional incidents, no violence, no escape attempts, no breakdowns. They were described as compliant, attentive, patient. They waited. The punishment did not seem to distress them. What distressed the system was its inability to conclude their punishment. As I shut down the terminal, it occurred to me that a prison is not defined by walls or guards. It is defined by its authority to decide when a sentence ends. And Alcatraz, at least on paper, had never fully learned how to do that. The end of the week, the records no longer felt historical. They felt active, not in the sense that they changed dramatically, but in the way a system remains active even when no one is watching it, quietly maintaining balance according to rules that no longer make sense to the people observing them. I began tracking update timestamps. That was when I noticed something that should not have been possible. Several files had been modified after the prison officially closed. Not recently, not decades later due to digitization. The updates clustered around specific years, long after Alcatraz ceased operation, and each update corresponded to the same group of unresolved inmates. There were no user credentials attached to those changes. At first, I assumed a metadata corruption issue. That explanation collapsed when I found handwritten documents mirroring those same updates. Physical paperwork added to files after the prison's closure, stored in boxes that had been sealed and cataloged decades earlier. The chronology did not merely fail digitally, it failed physically. I requested access to external correspondence, letters sent to federal offices, internal memos never forwarded, drafts that were never signed. In several of them, administrators struggled to articulate the problem. They did not describe wrongdoing. They described procedural discomfort. One memo ended with the sentence, "The sentence appears to be continuing without us." That line stayed with me. I tried to understand how the inmates themselves responded. Medical notes provided the clearest insight. Over time, some of the affected men stopped asking questions about release. They stopped tracking dates. They stopped framing their lives in terms of before and after. They did not deteriorate. They stabilized. Doctors described them as unusually calm, oriented, cooperative. They slept well. They followed routines with precision. They did not express hopelessness. They did not express hope. They behaved as if they had accepted a condition rather than a duration. I compared this to inmates whose sentences were clearly defined. Those men resisted. They counted days. They fixated on milestones. They suffered. The men with unstable sentences did not. One psychological assessment stood out. The evaluator wrote that the inmate appeared temporally compliant. The phrase had no diagnostic meaning. It was never used again. But it captured something the writer could not otherwise describe. That night, I noticed something disturbing about my own work habits. I had stopped checking the time. I ate when the task ended, not when I was hungry. I slept when there was nothing left to process. I did not feel rushed or delayed. I felt scheduled. The realization unsettled me enough that I attempted to disrupt my routine deliberately. I left the archives early and walked the perimeter of the island. The open space should have felt relieving. Instead, it felt poorly defined, like a margin without text. When I returned to the records room the next morning, the terminal logged me in automatically. I do not remember entering my credentials. A new notification awaited me. It was attached to one of the unstable inmate files. The review I had not submitted had been completed. The status had not changed. The note read, "Continuation confirmed." There was no author. I searched the system logs. No trace of who had processed it. No external access recorded. No anomaly flagged. The system had reviewed itself. At that point, the conclusion I had been avoiding became unavoidable. These sentences were no longer being administered by people. They were being preserved by process. Not out of malice, not out of intent, out of continuity. The punishment had detached from its origin and become self-sustaining. As I closed the file, I noticed something new in the database interface, a filter I had not used before. It was labeled Active Records. When I applied it, the list was short, too short. And at the very bottom, highlighted but unselected, was an empty row waiting for input. The empty rows stayed on the screen longer than it should have. Not because it moved or blinked, but because my attention kept returning to it despite every attempt to ignore it. The database did not prompt me to fill it in. It simply existed, positioned where the next unresolved entry would logically appear. I closed the filter and returned to general records. The sense of unease did not fade. It reorganized itself into something quieter and more procedural. I began to understand that whatever I was observing did not operate on urgency. It operated on patience. That afternoon, I reviewed procedural manuals from the final years of Alcatraz's operation. Not policy statements, but internal training documents, flowcharts, decision trees, escalation protocols. They were designed to remove ambiguity from punishment. Every outcome was supposed to lead to closure. Except there was one exception category, rarely used, poorly defined: pending resolution. The manuals offered guidance on how to manage it. Continue observation, maintain documentation, reassess at intervals. There was no instruction for termination. The category was not meant to be permanent. It simply had no built-in end. I traced how often it had been used. Almost never at first. Then gradually more frequently, clustered around cases with indeterminate sentencing and repeated administrative reviews. Each time it was invoked, it delayed final classification without technically violating procedure. The system did not break, it deferred. I found an internal audit report written shortly before the prison's closure. It identified anomalous continuity issues and recommended transferring several unresolved cases to federal oversight. The transfer never occurred. Not because it was denied, but because the files never left the building. Shipping manifests showed them listed as sent. Receiving logs showed nothing received. They had remained administratively present on the island even after physical custody ended. That evening, while reviewing digitization logs, I noticed that my own activity metrics had changed. The system tracked session duration, keystrokes, idle time. My idle time had dropped significantly, not because I was rushing, but because I was pausing less often, thinking less between actions. I was becoming efficient in a way that felt unearned. I attempted to take a full day away from the archives. I told myself it was a necessary break. I boarded the ferry and went into the city. The noise was immediate, the unpredictability exhausting. Conversations overlapped, schedules collided. Nothing waited its turn. I returned to the island that same evening. When I reopened the database, the empty row was still there. It had not filled itself. It had not disappeared. It was waiting for qualification. I clicked into its fields out of curiosity more than intent. Name, inmate number, sentence start, sentence end, status, continuity. Most fields were blank. Some were locked. The sentence end field was grayed out entirely. The continuity field was active. The drop-down options were the same: stable, unstable. Below it was a checkbox. Under review. It was unchecked. I exited without saving. That night, I reread personal correspondence from former staff. Retirement letters, exit interviews, casual remarks. Several mentioned difficulty adjusting after leaving the island. Not trauma, not regret. Discomfort with civilian structures. Complaints about schedules being too flexible. Decisions requiring too much initiative. One letter ended with a sentence that felt less like reflection and more like resignation. At least there, things continued. I slept poorly, not because of fear, but because of a subtle sense that something remained unresolved, a task left open. I woke repeatedly with the feeling that I had missed a step. The next morning, I found a new notification in the system, not attached to any inmate file. It was addressed to me. Administrative continuity requires participant acknowledgement. There was no option to respond, only an option to proceed. I closed the message and sat still for a long time. It was clear now that the system did not distinguish sharply between observer and subject. Anyone who interacted with unresolved punishment long enough became part of the process that sustained it. The prison did not need inmates anymore. It needed continuity. And continuity required participation. I did not accept the prompt immediately. I told myself that acknowledgement did not imply consent, that systems often used language imprecisely. Still, I understood the implication clearly enough. The process was waiting for a human reference point, someone to occupy the unresolved space. I returned to the earliest records one last time. I wanted to confirm whether anyone had ever successfully exited this category once it had been applied. I found no such case. Files marked as pending resolution never transitioned to completed. They either remained indefinitely or disappeared from circulation without closure. Disappearance, I realized, was not resolution. It was removal from review. The system did not release unresolved sentences. It absorbed them. I considered leaving the project unfinished, walking away, declining further interaction. But that assumption relied on the idea that disengagement was neutral. The record suggested otherwise. When oversight ceased, continuity did not stop. It simply operated without witness. I returned to the empty row. I filled in the name field. My own. The system accepted it without hesitation. No warning appeared, no error. The inmate number field auto-populated with a neutral identifier. Not a prison number, an administrative one, something used for tracking rather than punishment. The sentence start date populated with the date I arrived on the island. The sentence end field remained inaccessible. Status defaulted to active. The continuity field was set to unstable. I paused before checking the final box, under review. It occurred to me then that review did not mean evaluation. It meant maintenance. To be under review was to be kept present, indefinitely examinable, never final. I checked the box. Nothing happened. There was no confirmation message, no change in the room. The system simply updated the file and moved on, the way it always had. In the days that followed, I noticed that my departure plans became increasingly difficult to finalize. Schedules conflicted, authorizations delayed. Paperwork required clarification, not denial, just continuation. No one explicitly prevented me from leaving. There was always another step. I stopped thinking in terms of release. I thought in terms of status. That was when I understood the true nature of the sentence Alcatraz had perfected. It was not confinement. It was deferral. A punishment that never concludes because conclusion would require a decisive act the system is structurally incapable of making. I still live on the mainland. I am not imprisoned. I am not monitored. I am not restricted. My file continues to update. Addresses change. Employment status refreshes. Notes are added. The sentence remains active. Occasionally, I receive automated notifications indicating that my status is under review. They require no response. I have stopped expecting one. Because the purpose of the system was never to punish efficiently. It was to ensure that some sentences never end. Not because of cruelty, but because unresolved processes demand persistence. Alcatraz no longer needs walls. It does not need guards. It does not even need prisoners. It only needs someone to remain administratively unfinished. And now, that requirement has been met.